The late, great Whitney Houston is famous for the phrase and the song, I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Well, I'm happy and excited about the work that SAP is doing to really provide technological skills to youth to help them lead the way. And so I'm excited to introduce Alicia Lenze, the Vice President and Head of CSR at SAP, along with Jon Clifton, Managing Director of Global Analytics at Gallup, and John-Ubong Silas, Senior Director of Programs and Engagement at LDI Africa. Lead the way.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having us here today. So our panel today is really here to talk about the opportunity and challenges of activating youth as we look at the global goals. And I think a good place to start is to talk about what we're talking about. The UN says that today there are more young people on the planet than at any time in history. We're talking about 1.8 billion young people, and a big part of this is sort of this millennial generation that everyone likes to talk about. And in many ways, the millennials have it really good. The SDGs did make a lot of progress in terms of getting more young people into schools than ever before. So, we're looking at a generation that's more educated, more connected than ever before in history. These are true digital natives in a lot of ways. But at the same time, young people these days are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. We're looking at up to 90 million young people who are unemployed on the planet, although John is going to have some more details about those statistics. But really 85% are in the developing world, which is a huge challenge for us. From an SAP perspective, we are the largest enterprise software provider in the world. And what keeps us up at night is really thinking about this issue of youth unemployment, and at the same time, the huge anticipated gap in skills that we're going to need to educate people to be able to be part of our digital workforce. It's estimated that 40 million jobs are going to be missing in the IT sector by 2020. And we really actually see some danger of that even growing higher as the digital transformation is taking over all industries. So IT is not just IT. Every industry is turning into a digital industry, and that is a huge, huge challenge for us. So that's really why we put our focus around the topic of how can we give young people the skills they need to not just be productive in the digital economy, but also solve major issues that we're going to be looking at.
That's great. It's interesting because this is a discussion about activating youth. And if we are going to activate youth, it might serve us well if we understood what exactly it is that makes a great life for youth. And so Gallup actually did a study in 160 countries where we asked young people, what's the single biggest thing that would create a great life for you? And the single thing that they said, among all other issues, is to have a great job. But there's a challenge right now, because how we quantify jobs and how we quantify the job situation is it grossly underestimates exactly what the problem is. Right now, the ILO, when you go to the ILO and say, what is global unemployment? They say it's 5.9%. When you look at data like levels of poverty, what percent of people live under $2 a day, it's half of the world. So when you compare that figure to 5.9% of adults who are unemployed, it drastically underestimates exactly what the problem is. So Gallup studied this issue, and we went out and we said, what is the real global jobs problem? And based on how we asked the questions, which are very similar to what the ILO does, we found that of the 3.2 billion people around the planet that actually want a good job, only 1.3 actually have a good job. But what that means is 1.9 billion don't. But the problem's worse, because in our research, we find that if you're in a job that you hate, your life is actually worse than someone who has no work whatsoever. And so somebody needs to go in and understand quality of jobs, and we did that. So we went in and asked people in a very subjective way whether or not they knew what they were supposed to do in their job, whether or not they had the materials and resources in order to do their job effectively, or whether or not they were able to use their strengths. And what we found, if you look at the people that have a good job, who actually have a great job, that number drops all the way to 161 million people who actually have a great job, which means over 3 billion people around the planet don't. And so what we need to do is not only get the data right for leaders, but also create solutions, not just to get people like they're a pair of hands to working. We need to get them jobs that are great jobs that use their strengths. And John, interestingly enough, you and I were talking about this outside just recently, but you're actually doing some of these things in Nigeria. So it might be interesting to hear from you about some of the things that you and your organization are doing to actually correct that global problem.
Okay, thanks. So in 2014, actually, I was able to be an LDI Africa Fellow. And what that is an opportunity through LDI Africa, is a nonprofit organization that provides service opportunities for mid-level professionals to go onto the continent and utilize their skill sets. I had the good fortune to be placed at an international boarding school, Alicia Lenze International, in Osun State, Nigeria. And my role there was to develop a global leadership curriculum for students. And so one of the fundamental aspects of the founder, who was the late Oba Olashere, was that he believed that service was a great vehicle for leadership development. And so with that, and also doing some research, I was able to develop a leadership development curriculum based on the social change model of leadership development. And basically, the social change model of leadership has two premises about leadership. One is that the only purpose of true leadership is to affect positive change. And then the second component is that in order to do that, you need to work in a collaborative space. And so through that, they go through 7 modules, which one begins in the individual component, then moves to the group dynamic, and then the last stage is a global citizen perspective, which ties into students conducting a social change project, meaning that they identify an issue there on the ground, and then they actually, as a group, work to solve or address that issue. And I'll give you an example of one of the projects that the students did. One of the things that Olashere has is a partnership with a local primary school. And so the students were tasked in helping teachers provide supplemental learning tools to enhance student engagement. One of the challenges that the local school had was that obviously limited resources. And so the students took charge of that by meeting with teachers and understanding and trying to figure out how they could use resources that they created to help students be more engaged and, again, more attentive in class. One subject area that they focused on was Yoruba. Yoruba is a traditional language that's spoken in that area. What they found in looking at the textbooks that the students had, was that one, obviously, was outdated, and also, secondly, that in the context, it used examples in an urban setting or urban environment, which was strange, or it wasn't connected to the students because they lived in a very rural space. And so what they did, they took ownership of it, and they actually created supplemental tools and gave examples and coloring and drawings and stuff like that. There was one particular girl, Fien, who just took ownership. She bought into the project and just led the way. We had frank conversations about asking why these students didn't have some of these resources, and I just saw the growth in her. And so at the end, they presented the tools that they had provided, and the children were really engaged. And she told me 2 things. One was that she realized that she didn't have to wait to be an adult to make an impact in their society. And the second thing she said was that it didn't take that much energy to contribute something tangible to their immediate community. So I thought that was very profound for a 16-year-old to really realize that. And I could see her projection now, starting up a nonprofit organization when she becomes older. But we have planted that seed in her, and I think that is one of the impacts that we can do early on.
Excellent.
Great. Yeah, I would maybe just sort of like to react a little bit to some of the information you shared about the Gallup study. When looking at making SAP an attractive employer for young people, that's obviously an important part of our long-term strategy to be able to get the best and the brightest to come and work for us. This issue of not just good jobs but great jobs and being able to provide that engaging environment is really front and center for us. When SAP sort of looks at setting out our corporate objectives, it's not just revenues, it's not just operating profit, it's not just customer success, but the fourth indicator we set for ourselves of success is employee engagement. And employee engagement is really everything you're talking about. Does this job, do I know what's expected of me? Is it fulfilling? Do I know what I'm going to do when I'm going to work? And does it make me happy? And that's one of our 4 corporate objectives, to reach a really high score on that. And we see that when our employees have opportunities to get engaged and have a job with purpose and make a difference, engage in activities where they go out and work with young people and improve people's lives and have real social impact, that has an effect on our bottom line because they are more engaged. And we measure this, and we know that they score 90% on employee engagement as opposed to 79% for an average employee. We've also taken the step of doing the connection between non-financial and financial results that says for every 1 percentage point change in employee engagement, that actually results in 35 to 45 million on our bottom line. So this idea of being able to offer great jobs to young people is part of our future success, and is going to be an impact on how much money we make.
Yeah, definitely. John-Ubong, you actually brought up a really interesting point, which is the comment that the young woman made in Nigeria when she said, "I don't need to wait till I'm an adult to make an impact on the world." And I think, as I mentioned earlier, what Gallup has found, the single biggest issue facing the world is jobs. What is it that young people can do now that would help address that problem? We found who are the job creators. At least in the United States, we found that over 60% of all new jobs created in America are created by shoot-ups, which are great entrepreneurs. And so what we would suggest is there are great entrepreneurs at very young ages. In fact, we go into schools in the United States and ask young people, would you like to be your own boss? Would you like to start your own business? Large amounts of young people say yes to that. By the way, at some point when they get older, they start to say no to that. What we need to do is tell those young people, you don't need to change that. And in fact, we need entrepreneurs more than ever right now. The reason for that is when you look at data from the census, for the first time in 40 years of tracking, more businesses are dying than they are being born. This is the first time that statistic has ever happened. So what we need is for those young people to help us solve the single greatest problem that's facing the planet today is to start new businesses. So that would be my contribution to that portion of the conversation. And it would be interesting to hear more about what you see in terms of that issue, entrepreneurship, in Nigeria and the work that you've done throughout the region.
Well, I think entrepreneurship is definitely a vehicle to addressing the skill gaps and the opportunity for employment for the youth. However, I would like to talk about something that is often not talked about that is aligned with the skills gap, and that is the opportunity gap. Before the youth are able to sometimes take full advantage of these opportunities, there are sometimes social, cultural, economic, environmental challenges that prevent them or inhibit them from taking full advantage of these opportunities. For example, in terms of in the area of vocational training, which is something that is being done very much so in Africa. I'll give you an example of one organization that's trying to address that, and it's Wave Academy, which is in Nigeria. And it was started by a diasporan who came back, returned, and what she's trying to do, the organization's trying to do, is provide that pathway to localize the curriculum. So no matter how great the program training is, if you don't address some of those local challenges or issues, then the youth will not have the ability to take full advantage of these opportunities. So in the space that she works in, it's hospitality. And so in Nigeria, it's a booming space. So there's a lot of hotels coming up in Victoria Island, okay? Now, individuals that are working in that to try and get in that industry live primarily very far out in the outskirts. So one of the challenges that she identified was that, and wasn't talked about, was the logistical nightmare that is Lagos, okay? From getting from point A to point B is extremely challenging. So then how would that impact? And individuals who, again, trying to get to those jobs on a regular basis, what type of resources, what type of mechanisms can they put in place to ensure that, again, timeliness, which is a factor, a critical factor for employment success, can be at least mitigated or minimized for the early start. So these are just some things that I think individuals and organizations who many times have the heart, good intentions, great program design, but they overlook that opportunity gap and addressing that opportunity gap.
Just one other point on that is you talked a little bit about the environments for people that would be entrepreneurs. And it's so interesting because we ask a question around the world, which is in the city or area where you live, is it easy for entrepreneurs to start a business? Now, you might think that America does very well on that, and some developing countries don't do very well on that. But the answer is that one of the countries that scores the highest in the entire world on whether or not it's easy to start a business, China. Overwhelming majority of people actually respond yes to that in the city or area where they live, it's easy to start a business. So that's one of those factors I think that young people could be thinking about is how do they create a better condition for great new organizations to start and help change the world. We, interestingly enough, did you want to react to that?
No, it's okay.
Oh, I was going to say, we've had some folks on Twitter that have been asking us a few questions. So I thought I might start with this question from the Model UN from Washington, which is, what is the greatest natural threat to sustainable development outside of climate change?
All right, well, that's a pretty big one, but I think we'll keep it in line with this conversation. And actually, I think Angela Merkel has also said this. I really think it's youth unemployment. I think giving young people opportunities, particularly as we see this amazing demographic change, is going to be crucial. And not just from an economics opportunity standpoint, but from also a safety and security standpoint. We need to be getting people into good jobs where they feel like they have opportunities for their life.
John-Ubong, do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, maybe I can ask you a follow-up question. This one comes from Namdi Umuna from Nigeria, and she says, students in most of our universities have some hours of vital time every week. How can they channel these hours to the SDGs? What can they do?
Well, absolutely. I think the model that I talked about, the social change project, identifying things that they're passionate about and coming into it as a group and addressing those things. I think sometimes we wait for an external agent to address some of the critical issues. And again, once you start in that process, you finally realize that it's not the energy needed to exert to actually make a tangible impact is not as great as you think. And once you start the momentum, it will grow and evolve and continue. And I think the hardest thing many times for youth and people in general is to make that first step. Yep. Is to try. And it's okay if it's not at first successful. It's okay, but you need to do something. Try. So that would be my advice.
Alicia, just that same question, but students in America who might have idle time, what contributions could they make to the SDGs?
Well, I mean, it's the same thing. Get out and try. There was a young woman on a panel yesterday who had really talked about how volunteering really changed her life. And she had gone on to the United Nations volunteer platform and found some projects where she just started working there. But for us here in the U.S., there's so many opportunities to work with local organizations on challenges that you personally feel passionate about. Because unless you feel a personal connection to it, it's not going to be sustainable.
Alicia, this one's actually specifically for you from one of the Twitter accounts. But what is the approach of corporate volunteerism to create attitudinal changes and also make them sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, I think corporate volunteering has so much potential, particularly as we look at what's the role of corporations in addressing the sustainable development goals. Going back to what John-Ubong was saying, it's getting people to take that first step and having a corporate volunteering experience that they really feel is transformational and gets them engaged and excited. And that doesn't always necessarily have to be I'm going to go out and work in the emerging market for 1 month. It can be doing something locally and then working your way up to it. But we know that particularly with our employees that take part in the longer term pro bono engagement opportunities, they come back and report, very clear progress in terms of leadership skills and competencies and intercultural awareness, which is incredibly valuable for us as a company, and I think, helps us make that social impact we want to see in the world.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like we're being signaled that our time is up. So I will turn it then quickly to our moderator.